Well, Paul, it's a pleasure to meet you. I have now read the John Gorton book written by you, sir, and the reality is that today there'd only be Manfred Cross, Bill Hayden, myself, and a Dr. Bob Solomon from Sydney, who's also, and the other three are all out of it, virtually, who were alive in John Gorton's time as Prime Minister of Australia. And it brought back a lot of wonderful memories because I thought the world of John Gorton. And your book was extremely balanced, fair. You obviously did a lot of research, and it's a pleasure to be here with you today.
Oh, thank you, Don, for those kind words. It's a real pleasure to catch up with you again. And I agree, John Gorton's a fascinating figure of political history. I was very fortunate to interview him in 1998, a few years before his death. He was very welcoming, and he welcomed me to his home in Vaucluse. It was a wonderful time to meet him, and he was full of great stories as well. So, look, I think he's always been a much misunderstood figure in Australian history. And, reading Australian biographies of prime ministers, Gorton wrote no autobiography, and there's been a couple of biographies written about him. Again, polarised, some very, very flattering, others very, very scathing. It wasn't until Ian Hancock's book about 20 years ago that I think got the balance about right, I thought. You'd read a lot of detail about John Gorton's time in office in Compendia of Australian Prime Ministers, those coffee table books, and then, as footnotes in other books of Australian history. And the overwhelming consensus was that he was an appallingly bad Prime Minister. So I thought long and hard about this. I thought, well, is that really the case? Can a Prime Minister be so bad? And again, a lot of these attributions were John Gorton. The claims were that John Gorton almost single-handedly brought the Liberal Party of the Coalition down at the 1969 election. And again, being a student of history, being a student of historiography, you have to ask yourself, can a single human being really be responsible for such episodes in political history? There must be other factors at work. So this has been a very long-standing research project for me. I'm very interested in how individuals influence history, and my other interest, of course, is voter behaviour, how people vote and why they vote the way they do, particularly through the media lens, how voters respond to election campaigns and leadership, for example. So you put those two things together, and I've had I won't say lifelong, but certainly since my 20s, this fascination about John Gorton and the power of the individual in Australian political history. So being able to sit here with you today and talk to one of the few surviving members who came into the House of 1966, which I was age 3 then, and I have no recollection of 1963. The first election I can remember my parents talking about was 1972, and I've been fascinated by elections since 1972 because the conversation at the dinner table was so avid. But 1966 also looms large in Australian politics. You've got the decimalisation of Australian currency. You've got the landslide win of the Holt government led that year. You've got Menzies' retirement. You've got enthusiasm over the Vietnam War. So it's a really, I think, a pivotal cornerstone year in Australian politics. So if you to come into the Parliament in that landslide of 66, I think it's a great opportunity for us to hear your insights into John Gorton, the man, and Australia in 1966. So I'm just as thrilled to be sitting here with you, Don.
Well, thank you. I was born in 1940, and I became at that time Queensland's youngest ever to go to Canberra, and talk about being scared because I really didn't want that career. And I was just lucky in running in that year in the Labor seat of Griffith, and winning it, and going to Canberra with all the Labor guys calling me a oncer. And I thought, I'll show you what the word oncer can mean. In 1990, I finally gave it all away down there. But John Gorton came in because I had gone up to visit our Australian troops in Vietnam at the end of 1967 at my own expense. And I had reached Hong Kong the day that Harold went missing. And I was in a nightclub with... the police club, because a friend of mine was a inspector of police up there, and he took me there. And on the television news that came over that the search for the body of the Australian Prime Minister will be resumed at daylight tomorrow. I just could not believe what I was listening to. And in perspective, the whole bar went silent, but they all went back to drinking and laughing the moment it was all over. And I was left feeling, glum, and what the hell's gone on back in Australia.
Can I ask you, Don, how close to you to Harold?
Not very close.
Not very close.
Not very close at all.
Just
because I was one of the new boys on the block, right?
Right.
I was respectful, but I was on one huge learning curve, and I wasn't making any problem to anybody back then.
Right. So it'd be like a nodding, nod to Harold as you walk by the corridor type of thing, and
he knew who I was and would say good morning. But I was very respectful of the Prime Minister of the day.
That's right.
And then John Gorton nominated for the Prime Ministership, and as did, I think it was Les Berry.
That's right.
Billy Snedden and Paul Hazlitt.
That's right, yeah.
And I went for John Gorton because Billy Snedden was fairly young. Les Berry respected him, but I didn't see him as Prime Minister. And Paul Hazlitt, ironically, he was a poet. He would write poetry.
Indeed.
And I had asked his office 3 times because I had a blind constituent, a lady long gone called Murray, I forget her surname, who wanted a copy of some of his poetry. And his office didn't respond. And my view was, if this guy wants to be Prime Minister and he can't respond to a blind lady, how's he going to handle other people? So, I mean, that was a pretty harsh judgment to make. But that's why I went for John Gorton, because he'd been a senator, didn't know hardly any of the senators, but I chose him. And then in terms of getting to know him, Paul, about 5 months later, I invited him to come to Griffith to pay a visit. And I added a little attractive offer of coming up on a Friday and we'd go fishing for the weekend. So he said yes.
Which is very much in the Gorton style, the outdoorsman.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, anyhow, Bettina, his wife, came up a couple of days before, and we really travelled across Griffith. And that Friday night, John Gorton arrived. We had 2 hours in a hotel called the Combsley, which back then was very, very, very much a working man's area. And John Gorton came into the public bar. He was there for 2 hours, and I could not believe how, and mainly men, right? I don't think women were allowed in public bars by then.
It was just on the turn that women were camping. Mel Thornton, you might be Secret Thornton's mother, about the year before, had chained herself to a hotel in Toowong. So yes, so it's right on the cusp where they're changing the law.
Well, anyhow, I couldn't believe how these, when I say working men, they worked at the fish board, or they worked with their hands. They're all over him. And he just related so well to those people. And then we moved from bar to bar, and some of them even came from one bar just to be with him still. And we went 2 hours later, up and off.
So this is late 66, we're still talking
no, this is after he was elected.
So early 68.
Yeah, right. That would have been about May, I guess, 1968. So we went fishing, and one beautiful trait of John Gorton is at the end of it all, because with Harold Holt having been drowned only a few months before, they took, the Navy was there with a patrol vessel to keep a watchful eye on ensuring there was going to be another Cheviot Beach.
That's right.
And anyhow, at the end of it, that's right, John Gorton was a little bit disturbed by their proximity, but they ended up a good kilometre away, levers. But at the very end, John Gorton had caught a whole lot of mackerel. He asked Captain Herb Jennings to get the Navy to come up, and he handed over all his fish to the crew as a thank you, right? Which was just a nice little act, because I can tell you, if I'd caught the fish, I would have been taking them home to eat. That's not me. But anyhow, that was my beginnings to know John Gorton personally. And we, from then on, always had a very respectful, warm relationship. And when his time came to an end, in what was it, about February
March 71.
March 71.
It's actually today. Today is the 52nd anniversary. 52 years ago today, John Gorton left the prime ministership. So there you go. So it's very apropos that we have this podcast today.
Well, I was Zelman Cowan, who'd been the University of Queensland Vice Chancellor, had encouraged me to go and further my studies at the University of Queensland. I was doing a B of A. And after John Gorton was beaten 42 years ago.
52 years ago.
52, holy.
Yes,
I didn't realise how old it
March
was.
10, 1970.
Yeah, right. Well, 50-something years ago today, I thought about Billy McMahon, who had been prominent, right? And I kind of figured that, did I want to be a BA, of which there were literally thousands upon thousands, or an MP? Because, I mean, I had survived in 69, and I probably, looking back, the Labor candidate, a fellow called Barry Gorman, was probably the most intellectually gifted that Labor ever threw against me. And I caught up with him 3 or 4 years ago and had lunch
Nice.
at the Greek Club.
Can I just diverge there for a second? What would you attribute your success to, holding on to a seat that had been in Labor hands, 7% swing to the Labor Party in the 1969 election across the country? What do you attribute hanging on to?
I worked my backside off.
Door knocking, pamphleteering?
I had a wonderful secretary who did things that willingly, not even at my instigation. She would get out there and help bereaved families. I would go when I was back in Queensland, I'd go to functions. I'll never forget Murray, which is not far from where we are now.
That's right, in the east.
Murray was, I got 16% of the vote there in 1966.
Very working class area.
Yeah, mainly Housing Commission. And anyhow, when Mrs. Gorton came up, a lady in Murray, at my instigation, offered to put on a morning tea for her. Well, women came from everywhere. It was a women's show. I didn't even go, right? And when I finished in Griffith in 1975, last time I ran, my vote in Murray had trebled. And I would go to the RSL functions and everything and mix with them and enjoy their, because I was always very respectful of people regardless of their political habits, and never antagonistic. And it just built from there, I mean, they even threw Clem Jones at me.
That's right.
In 74.
Yes, that's right. That's right.
It scared the daylights out of me, I must admit. But,
well, the theory was, I'm sure you've heard it a million times, that the people of the Brisbane didn't want to see him go into federal politics. They wanted to keep him in the local politics.
Yeah, well, there
may be some truth to that.
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah.
I didn't care how I won.
A win's a win.
But anyhow, John Gorton, I mean, I've even a quote from your book, going back to 1946, shows what kind of man he really was. On page 33, I think it is. That's right. At 1946, he wrote this in a speech that he delivered at the Welcome Home.
That's right.
a function for service people and women.
And that's right, he did stress women.
Yep. Here we go. We, Gorton, 1946, we must remove from the minds of men the fear of poverty as the result of illness or accident or old age. We must turn our schools into institutions which will produce young men and women avid for further education and increased knowledge. We must raise the material standard of living so that all children can grow up with sufficient space and light and proper nourishment, so that women may be free of domestic drudgery, and so that scientific inventions which are conducive to a more gracious life may be brought within the means of us all. And I mean, when you think Gorton was writing that back in 1946, was indicative of his thinking processes, which made him, when he was a senior minister and then later prime minister, someone that many people warmed to greatly, because he was caring about people's living standards rising. And I think during his term, about 250,000 more Australians gained access to proper health care.
That's right.
And, you know, some might say he was very social minded. Well, as a Liberal, I love a Prime Minister that has got a good balance of his view of the economy without excess wastage, and also social issues which affect people across the board and mainly in the lower income group. So John Gorton fulfilled all that, you know, in my opinion.
Now, a lot of those things that you said and that John believed in from the 1940s, even before probably in the 1930s, really. He joined the Country Party, first of all, in the 1930s, and he followed his father's footsteps. And he inherited the Victorian orchard from his father when his father died relatively young. He'd gone off to war. He was, in my view, was a war hero, but if anyone said to him, "You're a hero, John," he would just scoff and say that's nonsense. He had 4 near-death experiences. He survived the rigors of war, had terrible facial injuries when he crashed his plane. So
First into the...
Absolutely. And he had a lot of, headwinds, in terms of his personal life. And, he'd had a master's degree from Oxford. So he had this, incredibly eclectic world experience. And a lot of people then and since have said, well, some of those things that John Gorton said and did could easily come out of the mouth of a Labor politician. And so they saw him as socially progressive on some things, but arch conservative on others. He was at the same time, while he was talking up, education opportunities for disadvantaged, he was also saying, he's one of the toughest anti-communist hawks in the Parliament. Yeah. So I could have easily called this book The Paradoxical Prime Minister, because John Gorton is full of paradoxes. And I think every politician is probably full of paradoxes, because you've got the private and public lives crashing head on every day. Yeah. And I think it takes a sort of special person to be able to reconcile that. Personally, I don't think I could. It takes a special breed to weather that sort of personal public storm. And John Gorton was certainly one of those. But I think John Gorton was probably the most paradoxical prime minister this country's ever seen, and probably one of the hardest, if not the hardest, to understand. So I could have called this book The Paradoxical Prime Minister. I went with Australian to the Bootheels because that's the phrase with which he's most commonly associated. Everyone knows that phrase. Because he was full of all these paradoxes. So he could say and do things that easily come out of the Labor Party and had sympathy for the poor. He really engaged women. He engaged Indigenous people. He engaged the arts. He wrote poetry, although he didn't tell anyone about it. He had poetry published anonymously. So, but he passed himself off as a Philistine. So he had this tough, rugged exterior, but he was quite a shy and sensitive man. So he's full of these paradoxes. And I think those paradoxes come together in something that we call Gortonism. So what is Gortonism? Gortonism is a mix of, Australian nationalism, but smaller liberalism to help the poor. It's also about taking control of the government, centralism, Canberra over the states, but it's also about respecting differences. And I could go on. There's many different ways of deconstructing Gortonism, but what's your take on that? What did you, I mean, did people talk about the Gorton style? And at what point did the Gorton style start to become a bit of an albatross around the Prime Minister's own neck and the Liberal Party's neck?
Yeah, well, Paul, I disagree with you to the point of being caring is not of people who are struggling, is not just prerogative of Labor-leaning people. For instance, Menzies would not have survived from 49 till 66 had Liberals and Country Party as their coalition partner not being caring for people of all backgrounds. And I don't see it quite as you've seen it, that my mob don't care or care as much because we do. And I would never have survived if I had appeared in my Griffith days as not caring. Now, in terms of Gorton, yes, complex, I agree. Not straightforward. At times he would have annoyed ministers, and I know how there was a formation of the Mushroom Club.
Yes, I'll get you to talk more about that in a moment, if you would.
Well, I was never a member, but you know that was all a result of ministers feeling out of it and not consulted to the extent they thought they should be. And that's probably true because they wouldn't have formed it unless they had a unified view and like, what are we doing around here? Kind of.
Interestingly, John Gorton insisted he joined.
I know he became
and Chief Spall.
Yeah, yes. Absolutely.
Can I just I'll set this record straight. I suppose what I was saying, I wasn't trying to impugn the Liberals' position on a caring society. More sort of highlighting that would be the media dichotomy. You know, the media would have portrayed this, the electorate would have seen it as the party, the middle class versus the party of the working class. And so outside observers would look at this and say, it was often said, again, as you would probably have heard, that some of the conservative critics of John Gorton and the party would say, oh, he was a Labour wolf in sheep's clothing all along. Yeah. That sort of thing.
Well, none of us in life gets everything right. And every Prime Minister, and we're up to 31 now, I think.
Yes, I believe that's.
I think it'll be about 31.
Yes.
Everyone has his strengths and his differences, and that makes, or she, because Julia, and they're no different to human beings. They're just someone who's gone higher up the ladder. And I just think, really, I would hope that a lot of people read your book.
Thanks, Don.
Because I think Gorton, you refer to his Air Force background, and I was a member of the CMF, Citizen Military Forces, way back, and I believe that probably gave me an additional attraction to Gorton, because not that I ever fired a gun in anger, but Gorton, sure, shot out by the Japs in one instance, then on a boat being shipped back to New Zealand, which was torpedoed, yes. And then 2 crashes at his instigation and I remember him saying, with his ugly face, which I found attractive anyhow.
And a lot of people did. Yeah, some women said he was, it was an attractive ugliness.
Absolutely.
Yes. It was a weathered masculine face.
Yeah, and he would say, if you had as much of your backside on your face as I have on mine, you'd be ugly too.
That's right. That's right.
Because that was all a result of the operation.
And plastic surgery those days was
very new. Yeah. So they wouldn't have done nearly a job as they do today, but still, I wouldn't like my backside on my
not
face.
Particularly. So look, what do you think? And I sort of draw this to a conclusion in the book about what we might offer, what John Gorton might offer us today, Australian politics today, whether it be the Liberal Party specifically or Australian politics generally. What do you think Gortonism or John Gorton could offer today?
Well, as much as I love John Gorton, In his final years down there, I was not as easy with things that he was progressing that I was in early years. But I never, ever lost my love for him, and I even attended his funeral out of respect. And but nothing stays the same, Paul. And the world of today is very, very different than the world of John Gorton, Harold Holt, Bob Menzies, Gough Whitlam, name them all, right? And when I look at John Gorton and your specific question of what would he offer politics today, probably a voice of conscience. But if he was still alive, what year was he born? About 1911?
He was born in 1911.
Yeah,
right.
So he would be 124. No, yeah, 114.
He'd be 112.
12,
yes.
Sorry, my maths.
Almost, yes. No, September 9th, he was born.
Yeah,
So coming up for 112.
My maths used to be good at school, but they're getting...
You're excused.
But still, I don't think John would have much to offer today.
Let's take, you mentioned one person we've talked probably too little about is the relationship between Gorton and Menzies. I wrote that, and again, I'm being so young, not being born during most of Menzies' prime ministership, but what I have read is that Menzies didn't suffer fools gladly, and Gorton probably didn't suffer fools gladly either. They were two strong intellects. One was a very senior politician, one was a very junior politician, and Gorton used to give Menzies a bit of... Now, obviously, you came into the parliament after Menzies was there, but what's your understanding about how did Gorton and Menzies engage?
Well, I think you're right, and I learned about that on reading your book. But to offset that, Menzies was promoting Gorton even up to the leader of the Senate before he's...
Even behind the scenes?
Yeah.
Okay.
And that says a lot.
It does say a lot.
It may well have been in his early career, Gorton might have annoyed Bob a bit, Bob Menzies, but as time went on, Menzies saw that Gorton had skills and talents, and I think gave him 2 or 3 promotions in those years. And that's probably made it possible for Gorton to make it into the House of Reps.
And to finish, so do you think that Australia would welcome a John Gorton-esque figure today, given that Australians are probably sick of, what we call white bread politicians, no fibre and all cut from the same loaf? Politicians today are so risk averse because they don't want to be caught up in the soundbite. They have to screen every tweet before they send it out. Do you think they'd like a quintessentially Australian Prime Minister, rough and guts, who will just say what's on his mind? Do you think he would be a success today, or would he be pushed to the margins?
I would suspect that the media would make such a feast of a person with John's traits today. I see beat ups, even in the daily newspapers and everything. Whether John Gorton would have said, "Get nicked, I'm doing it my way," and got away with it, sadly, we're only wondering and guessing, But I just would hope very much that a lot of people take the time to buy the book, read it, because with his background as being shot out of the sky and being torpedoed and all that, there's never been a Prime Minister who came to the job with such a training as he did in terms of survival.
Oh, I agree, Don. And let's just finish by saying what a great pleasure it is to talk to you today. Thank you.
My pleasure. Yeah.
All right, well done. Good job.
That was good.
Okay.
We could have kept going.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you.
No, my pleasure. And
Were
thanks
you
for,
happy, sir?
Yes, yes.
oh, that was